Welcome viewers, you are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare yourself for a journey into a world where secrets have been buried for decades and the truth has been locked away in the shadows of an ancient mansion. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Scent of the Forgotten Killer. Sherlock Holmes stepped out of the carriage and onto the gravel path leading to the mansion's entrance, his sharp gaze sweeping the crumbling estate before him. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and old wood, the mansion's silhouette a dark shadow against the grey sky. This house had been abandoned for over 50 years, or so it was believed. Yet here it stood, haunting, forgotten, and now the setting for an enigma he could not ignore. His thoughts were already unraveling the mystery, one thread at a time, before he had even entered the building. "Watson?" Holmes murmured, adjusting the collar of his overcoat. "Do not be fooled by the tranquil appearance of this place. Beneath this stillness lies something far more unsettling." Dr. Watson, his ever-faithful companion, stepped beside him with a slight frown, his brow furrowed in concern. "Holmes, are you certain about this? The house has been empty for decades. How could there be anything of significance left here?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued his steady advance, his eyes scanning the iron gates that had once been majestic but now stood rusted, the estate grounds wild with neglect. With each step, a faint unease seemed to creep along his spine, but Holmes was too focused to entertain the sensation for long. His mind was already a labyrinth of possibilities, each more intriguing than the last. The heavy wooden doors of the mansion creaked open as they arrived, the scent of age and disuse spilling out to greet them. Holmes did not hesitate. He stepped inside, inhaling the musty air as if drawing in the very essence of the place. His boots echoed off the marble floors, the sound stark and cold in the otherwise quiet hall. Watson followed, looking around with a mixture of awe and skepticism. "This place feels like it hasn't seen life in years," Watson remarked, his voice betraying a hint of unease. Holmes nodded, his sharp eyes already darting to the staircase at the far end of the hall, where shadows lingered as if waiting to swallow them whole. "You would be right. But I assure you, Watson, there is life here, or at least the echo of it." Their footsteps echoed through the empty mansion as Holmes made his way deeper inside. He took in every detail, the faded wallpaper, the dust-covered furniture, the darkened windows through which no sunlight seemed to penetrate. Yet, despite the stillness, something unsettled him. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to disturb its peace. "Holmes, you're not suggesting that something of value remains in this decaying ruin?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "Value is a matter of perspective, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice cool and detached. He paused in front of a painting, its frame cracked and chipped, its subject a stern-faced man dressed in antiquated clothing. Holmes studied the portrait for a moment, his lips pressing into a thin line. "The value here is not monetary." With a sharp glance, Holmes turned toward the grand staircase. "The true value lies in what has been hidden, Watson. This place is not forgotten for lack of interest." Watson followed Holmes's gaze, now feeling a subtle shift in the air. He had seen Holmes's countless investigations, but this one felt different, as though the mansion itself was an active participant in the mystery they were about to unravel. The hairs on the back of Watson's neck stood on end as the tension thickened. "We must be vigilant," Holmes added, his voice lowering as he turned towards the stairs. "There are secrets here waiting to be uncovered." The staircase creaked under their weight as they ascended to the upper floor, where the thick shadows seemed to coil around the grand hallway. Holmes moved ahead, his keen eyes glinting in the dim light, searching for any clue that might reveal the mansion's mysteries. Watson followed, his footsteps hesitant but steady, unsure of what they would find next. The air was thick with dust and silence, each movement in the old house feeling like a violation of its long-forgotten slumber. At the top of the stairs they were greeted by the sharp scent of old leather and fading ink. Holmes glanced at a nearby bookshelf filled with ancient tomes and brittle papers. The historian had mentioned these books earlier. The house's original owner had been an avid collector of rare works. But there was something more to it, something he had not yet shared. Holmes didn't trust the historian's calm demeanor. There was a glimmer of something darker hidden beneath it, like a man trying too hard to maintain composure. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you get the sense that we're being watched?" Holmes did not answer immediately, instead pausing as his eyes settled on a nearby portrait. The face of a woman, pale and striking, stared back at him. She was dressed in fine clothing, but there was an unsettling coldness in her expression, an eerie stillness. "I do, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice low, "but not by any living person." Before Watson could question him further, the soft shuffle of footsteps interrupted their thoughts. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hallway, an elderly woman, hunched and fragile, with eyes that seemed too bright for her weathered face. She walked with a measured pace, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though she was holding on to something far more valuable than a mere sense of propriety. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she greeted them, her voice raspy but commanding. "I have been expecting you." Holmes studied her for a moment, his gaze flicking over her frail form and sharp eyes. She was the caretaker of the house, and something about her presence sent a shiver down Watson's spine. Despite her age and frailty, there was an air of control about her, a quiet authority that could not be ignored. "I assume you're here about the history of the house," the woman continued, her lips twitching into a thin smile. "Or perhaps you seek to uncover something more?" Holmes nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. "Both, I believe. There are many questions surrounding this house, and I intend to find the answers." The woman's smile faltered, but she did not retreat. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Be careful, Mr. Holmes. Some questions are better left unasked." The words lingered in the air like smoke, and for a moment Watson could almost taste the tension. He glanced at Holmes, whose brow remained furrowed in concentration. "You are not the first to say that," Holmes replied evenly, his voice calm but edged with a growing resolve. "But I will not be deterred." The woman's eyes flicked toward Watson, then back to Holmes. "Perhaps not," she said softly, "but in this house, time has a way of changing things." With that, she turned and shuffled back into the shadows, leaving the two men standing in silence, the weight of her cryptic words hanging heavily between them. "She's hiding something," Watson muttered, his voice tense with suspicion. Holmes did not immediately respond, but his gaze lingered on the spot where the woman had disappeared. "Indeed, Watson, and we will find out exactly what." Just then, the soft sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the hallway once more. This time, it was a younger man, a historian, his features sharp and his manner just a touch too eager. His glasses glinted in the low light as he approached with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson?" he said, his voice smooth but faintly nervous. "I trust you're finding the house to your liking?" Holmes did not return the smile. "Not yet, but I'm sure that will change once we speak." The historian's eyes darted briefly to the caretaker's retreating figure before he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I understand you have many questions, but I must warn you, not all of them should be answered." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "And why is that?" The historian glanced around nervously before leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This house, it holds memories, Mr. Holmes, memories that are not meant to be disturbed." Holmes' gaze sharpened, his mind already working through the implications. "And you, sir, are one of its keepers, but I doubt you are so easily swayed by your own warnings." The historian swallowed, his throat tight. "You are right, of course. I am merely trying to protect the sanctity of what remains here. The past is delicate." Holmes stepped closer, his voice firm. "The past may be delicate, but the truth cannot be avoided. You will answer my questions one way or another." The historian hesitated, his eyes flickering with fear before he nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, but know that some truths may be more dangerous than you can imagine." Holmes and Watson stood at the threshold of a room that had been locked away for decades, its dust-laden door creaking open under Holmes's steady hand. The atmosphere inside was stale, heavy with the smell of old timber and a trace of something more unsettling, something faintly chemical, like a scent that had been forced into the air to linger long after its source had vanished. The room, though small, seemed to hold the weight of forgotten years, its walls lined with neglected furniture draped in sheets that looked more like ghosts than belongings. "Holmes, what exactly are we looking for?" Watson asked, his voice barely a whisper as he entered cautiously. His eyes darted around the dimly lit space, trying to make sense of the surroundings. "This seems rather ordinary." Holmes, who had already stepped further into the room, scanned every corner with the precision of a man seeking a hidden truth. "Ordinary, Watson? No, not ordinary. There is something concealed here, something long buried." His voice dropped, becoming more contemplative, as though the room itself had begun to speak to him. A low light filtered in through the cracked windows, casting faint shadows across the floor. Holmes moved quickly, his steps measured as he approached an old armoire, its wooden frame marked by time. He reached out to touch it, his fingers lingering over the surface before he pulled the door open with a creak that echoed too loudly in the silence. The musty scent grew stronger, mixing now with something that almost smelled like decay. Inside the armoire was a set of shelves, holding various objects, old books, a tarnished silver tray, and an odd assortment of clothing. But it was something at the back, hidden beneath layers of faded cloth, that caught his attention. His fingers brushed aside the fabric with care, revealing the pale outline of a wooden crate, one that had clearly been there for years. Holmes' breath caught for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. He knew without doubt that this was the key to understanding the mystery. "Watson," he called, his voice urgent now. "Come here, you need to see this." Watson approached, his face drawn in curiosity, but when he saw the crate, his expression hardened with a mixture of confusion and unease. Holmes knelt, carefully lifting the lid of the crate. The faint chemical scent from earlier grew stronger as the contents were revealed. A small, decaying body, wrapped in aged linen. Its features obscured, but unmistakably human. The body, though decomposed, was clearly that of a child. For a moment, the world outside the room seemed to disappear. Watson's heart sank as he realized the significance of the discovery. "Holmes, what is this? A child? This can't be—" Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the body, his face impassive, though the flicker of something darker flashed in his eyes. "A child, Watson," he repeated quietly. "And yet, not just a child. This is the answer we've been searching for. The past has not been forgotten, and neither have its secrets." Watson stood frozen, his mind struggling to piece together what they had just uncovered. The air in the room felt suddenly thicker, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. But how? How could anyone leave a body here for so long? And why? Why hide it like this? Holmes stood slowly, his sharp eyes never leaving the small, lifeless figure in the crate. "That is what we are going to find out. This body, hidden away for decades, is not the work of some random murderer. No, Watson, this child was placed here deliberately, and the killer has left a trail for us to follow. The question now is why?" The realization hit Watson like a wave. The mystery had just deepened in a way neither of them could have anticipated. His mind raced as he absorbed the implications. Someone had carefully orchestrated the disappearance of this child, concealing it within the very walls of this mansion. It was no ordinary crime. It was a carefully planned act, one that spoke of motives far more sinister than he had ever imagined. Holmes turned his attention to the room once again, his mind already ticking through the possibilities. This child was not meant to be found, Watson, but someone made a mistake and now it is our job to uncover who and why." Watson looked at him, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him, but Holmes's calmness was a sharp contrast to the rising sense of dread that had settled over the room. Holmes had seen this before, the careful patterns of a mind willing to go to extreme lengths to hide a secret, and now that secret had been uncovered. But as Holmes stood there, his gaze already shifting to the next question, the lingering scent of decay seemed to follow them both, a reminder that the past had not been forgotten, merely hidden. The truth was coming, slowly but surely. The discovery of the child's remains left an unspoken weight hanging in the air as Holmes and Watson stepped away from the crate. The dim light of the room seemed colder now, as though the very walls had absorbed the gravity of what they had just uncovered. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his mind already working through the implications of their find, while Watson stood in silence, struggling to process the horror of it all. "We must gather more information," Holmes said, his voice low and controlled as he turned toward the door. "There is much to understand about this tragedy, Watson. This room will reveal more yet." Watson nodded, following closely behind as they exited the room and made their way down the narrow hallway. Holmes moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the precision of a hawk. Watson, still processing the ghastly discovery, took in the environment more slowly. The mansion was eerily silent, the heavy air pressing against them as they moved from room to room, each more foreboding than the last. The walls seemed to close in, as if the house itself was resisting their intrusion into its long-held secrets. Holmes paused in front of an old wooden desk in the study, his fingers brushing over the surface. The dust was thick here, the edges of the furniture darkened with neglect, but Holmes's sharp eyes were unfazed. He examined the papers scattered across the desk with meticulous attention. As he sifted through the documents, his expression shifted, a flicker of realization passing across his face. "Here," he muttered, holding up a yellowed letter. It was folded tightly, the ink faded but still legible in parts. "This is more than coincidence. These were written by the original owner of the house, a man whose name is becoming all too familiar." Watson leaned in, studying the letter. The words were written in a hurried hand, as though the writer had been in a panic. There were references to a secret project, a cryptic mention of unwanted attention, and finally a note of warning: "Do not let them know what we have done." "What does it mean?" Watson asked, a growing sense of unease creeping into his voice. What project was he speaking of? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the letter down carefully and turned toward the adjacent shelf, scanning the rows of books. His eyes landed on one in particular, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed with age. He pulled it from the shelf and flipped through it with practiced hands. The book seemed innocuous enough at first. A historical account of the mansion's early years, but as Holmes flipped through the pages, a particular passage caught his eye. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "This is not just history. This is a hidden account of the original owner's life, and it mentions a family secret. The project, it wasn't just an academic venture. It was a cover-up." Watson's brow furrowed. A cover-up? Of what? Holmes didn't answer at once, his mind racing through the possibilities. The pieces were starting to come together, but not in a way he had anticipated. The child we found, Watson, was never supposed to be discovered. This project, it was meant to ensure that certain truths were buried. What if this was a child that was never meant to be born in the first place? Watson recoiled, the thought unsettling him. "Are you suggesting that this child was part of something far darker? A secret that someone would go to great lengths to conceal?" Holmes nodded, his mind already sifting through the implications. "Yes, Watson, but who was the child, and why was it hidden away in such a manner? These are the questions we must answer. We need to dig deeper." Watson felt a cold shiver run through him as he looked around the room. Each object, each piece of furniture seemed to hold secrets. Not just of the mansion, but of the people who had once called it home. The sense of something insidious growing just beneath the surface made his skin crawl, but it was that same feeling that spurred Holmes onward. If anyone could make sense of it, it was Holmes. They moved on, the floorboards creaking underfoot as they approached a narrow doorway at the back of the house. The air in the hallway shifted, a faint draft passing through the old wood. Holmes reached for the doorknob, turning it with practiced ease. As the door creaked open, they found themselves in what seemed like an abandoned storage room. Piles of old furniture and forgotten trinkets were stacked haphazardly, but one item stood out. A large, ornate mirror framed in tarnished. Holmes stepped closer, his breath catching as he examined the reflection in the mirror. It seemed distorted, almost as though the glass was concealing something just beyond its surface. His hand reached out instinctively, brushing against the glass. A strange chill ran through him, as if the mirror itself had a pulse. "There is something here, Watson," Holmes murmured, his gaze fixed on the reflection. "Something that we cannot yet see." Watson felt the unease in his chest deepen as he joined Holmes in front of the mirror. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence pressing down upon them. The mystery was becoming more tangled with each step they took. It was no longer just about the child or the mansion's past. It was about the very secrets the house itself seemed to be hiding. The oppressive silence of the mansion seemed to grow thicker as Holmes and Watson made their way back down the narrow hallway, each step echoing like the beat of a drum. The mirror in the storage room had unsettled them both, but Holmes's keen mind was already piecing together the puzzle, seeking answers where others might see only shadows. The cryptic letter and the book on the family secret gnawed at his thoughts. The pieces were beginning to fit, but only just. "We need to speak with the people who knew the original owner," Holmes said quietly, his tone unyielding. "The historian, the caretaker. They are the key to understanding this. And the woman. She knows more than she's letting on." Watson, still uneasy from their earlier discoveries, nodded. "But can we trust them? Each one of them seems to be hiding something. The historian especially seemed nervous when we spoke of the child." Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, his sharp gaze swept the hallway ahead of them. He could almost feel the walls closing in, as though the house itself was closing ranks against them. "We must proceed with caution, Watson. Each of these people holds a piece of the puzzle. It's just a matter of finding which piece fits where." They approached the parlor, where the historian awaited them. His posture was rigid, his fingers tapping nervously against the side of the chair, as if he were trying to mask his anxiety. The scent of burning wood and leather filled the room as Holmes and Watson entered, the fireplace crackling softly in the corner. The historian glanced up, offering a tight smile, but there was something strained in his expression, something that didn't sit right with Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," the historian greeted them, his voice overly polite. "I trust your investigation is proceeding smoothly?" Holmes studied him closely, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Not smoothly enough," he replied, his voice cool. "There are too many gaps in the story you shared with us, too many inconsistencies. I trust you are not keeping anything from us, are you, Mr. Ashford?" The historian stiffened at the mention of his name, his hand faltering in mid-air as it reached for the glass of brandy on the table before him. He set it down quickly, his gaze darting away for a fraction of a second, a tell, subtle but telling. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I've told you everything I know," Ashford said, his voice just a little too quick, a little too rehearsed. "The mansion has been abandoned for decades. There's nothing hidden here." Holmes tilted his head, scrutinizing the historian's every movement. "But the house is not as abandoned as you claim, is it, Mr. Ashford? You mentioned that the original owner had a secret project, something that was kept out of the public eye. Could you elaborate on that? Or are you hoping that we will forget it altogether?" Ashford's eyes flickered nervously. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but paused, his expression faltering. It was clear that the walls were beginning to close in on him, but instead of giving in to the pressure, he chose to deflect. "Secrets are a part of every old house, Mr. Holmes," he said with a forced smile. "But the past is better left buried, don't you think? You don't want to stir up trouble that has long since been settled." Holmes stepped closer, his voice dropping into a measured whisper. "I believe, Mr. Ashford, that it is exactly the trouble you wish to keep buried that interests me the most." He turned toward Watson, his eyes still locked on the historian. "Let us continue our search elsewhere, Watson. It seems our friend is not as forthcoming as we had hoped." The tension between them was palpable as Holmes turned and strode toward the door, but just before he exited, he threw one last remark over his shoulder. "We'll be back, Mr. Ashford, and next time I expect you to be more cooperative." As Holmes and Watson exited the parlor, they could hear the soft sound of Ashford's chair scraping against the floor as he shifted nervously behind them. The air outside the parlor seemed to grow colder, a chill creeping up Watson's spine. "You think he's involved?" Watson asked, keeping his voice low. Holmes didn't respond right away. Instead, he stopped at the foot of the stairs, his eyes lost in thought. The historian was hiding something, but what? His reactions were too rehearsed, his words too carefully chosen. There was something about Ashford that didn't sit right with Holmes, something off-kilter in his demeanor. But still, Holmes knew there were other avenues to explore. The caretaker, for one, was equally as suspicious. "We need to speak with the woman again," Holmes said, his voice firm. "She knows more than she's letting on, and I believe she's hiding something crucial." The sound of their footsteps echoed through the hallway as they made their way back toward the back rooms, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. The house had become more than a place of investigation. It had become a character in its own right, cold, unforgiving, and unwilling to give up its secrets. Holmes led the way down the corridor, his steps deliberate and steady, but Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the heart of something darker than they had anticipated. The mansion seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each door they passed revealing more unsettling layers of history and hidden truths. Every room held its secrets, and Holmes seemed to know this instinctively. The air in the mansion had grown heavier since their discovery of the child's body, as though the house itself was beginning to stir, reluctant to give up what it had long concealed. Watson's stomach churned with unease, but he knew better than to let his nerves show. He glanced at Holmes, whose face was set in a mask of concentration, his eyes scanning the surroundings, looking for the smallest detail that might lead them to the truth. They stopped in front of the caretaker's quarters. Holmes raised his hand to knock, but paused for a moment, studying the door, as if reading the very wood. Watson could sense the shift in Holmes, the intensity in his posture, the sharpness in his gaze. "Holmes, what are you thinking?" Watson asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Holmes turned to face him, his eyes glinting with quiet determination. "I believe we've been fed lies, Watson. The story we've been told is only half true. The caretaker knows more than she's letting on." Before Watson could respond, the door opened. The frail figure of the caretaker stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, however, flickered with something that Holmes didn't miss, a trace of fear, quickly masked by the mask of politeness that had grown so familiar. "You are back sooner than I expected, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice soft, like an echo from another time. "I trust your investigation is going well?" Holmes' gaze never wavered from her face. "We're making progress," he replied evenly, "but I have some more questions if you would indulge me." The woman stepped aside, allowing them to enter. As they crossed the threshold, Watson was immediately struck by the dimness of the room. It was filled with old, heavy furniture, each piece covered in thick sheets. The air smelled stale, with an underlying scent of lavender. An attempt to mask the mustiness of the neglected quarters. A fireplace sat dormant in the corner, the hearth cold and uninviting. Holmes took a seat in an armchair by the window, his gaze fixed on the woman. Watson remained standing, his posture tense as he observed her every move. She had taken a seat across from them, folding her hands in her lap with an almost unnerving calmness. "I understand you've been here for many years," Holmes began, his tone casual but sharp beneath the surface. "You've seen the comings and goings of many individuals in this house, including the original owner's family. Perhaps you've seen something you shouldn't have." The woman's eyes flickered, a subtle movement, but Holmes caught it. Her composure faltered for just a fraction of a second. She cleared her throat, a nervous gesture, before speaking. "I've lived here most of my life," she said slowly. "But I'm not one to meddle in matters that don't concern me, Mr. Holmes. The past is the past. What's important now is that we preserve what little is left." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "What's left, do you mean the secrets?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "You see, the past cannot be preserved if it's built on lies, and I have a strong suspicion, Mrs. Temple, that you've been hiding something vital, something that could change everything." The woman's lips tightened, her eyes briefly darting away before she forced them back onto Holmes. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Mr. Holmes. The mansion has always been a quiet place. The only thing that should matter is that it remains that way." Holmes sat back, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "But I believe there's more, isn't there?" he pressed. "Something about the original owner's dealings that you've kept to yourself for many years." For a long moment there was silence. The only sound was the faint crackling of the wind outside, but it felt like an eternity. Then, finally, the caretaker spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "I was there, you know," she murmured, her gaze dropping to her hands, "when the decision was made. It wasn't supposed to go this far, but it did. And now it's too late to undo the damage." Watson felt a chill creep up his spine. He exchanged a quick glance with Holmes, who was still watching the woman intently. "Too late?" Watson echoed, his voice tight with curiosity. "What do you mean, too late?" The woman's hands trembled, but she didn't look up. "There were things that shouldn't have happened. The original owner, Mr. Charles Granger, he was involved in something that would ruin his name if it ever came to light. It was his project, the one that was never meant to be discovered." She swallowed hard, her voice catching in her throat. "He didn't want anyone to know, not even his family." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the child? Was the child part of this project?" She nodded slowly, her face now pale. "Yes, but I never meant to be involved in it. I was just a servant, but I saw too much, and I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I should have left when I had the chance, but I couldn't. And now—" Her voice trailed off, and for the first time, Holmes saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. The conversation with the caretaker had left Holmes with more questions than answers. As he and Watson retreated to a quiet room within the mansion, Holmes closed the door behind them, locking out the oppressive atmosphere of the house for a moment. The weight of the mystery now felt more tangible than ever. There were pieces of the puzzle scattered about, but they were far from fitting together in a way that made sense. Yet, Holmes' mind was already working, processing the fragments of information they had gathered. Holmes stood by the window, gazing out at the sprawling estate. The mansion seemed so tranquil from here, almost serene in its isolation, but he knew better. He turned away from the view, his eyes narrowing as he focused inward. The soft ticking of a clock on the mantel was the only sound in the room, but to Holmes it felt like a countdown. A countdown to the revelation that would tie everything together. "Watson," Holmes began, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "The pieces are all there. We have the letter from the original owner, the caretaker's confession, and the child's remains. Yet there is something still missing. Something crucial. The project, the secret, the hidden truths of this house. They are all connected." Watson sat across from him, still processing everything they had learned. "But how does it all fit together, Holmes? A hidden project, a child, and a family secret. How could these be tied to the murder?" Holmes's lips pressed together as he walked over to the desk where he had spread out the letter from Mr. Granger, the book on the mansion's history, and the various clues they had found. The letter mentioned a project, something secret that would ruin Granger's name if discovered. The caretaker's words, too, indicated that she knew far more than she had admitted. Yet there was still a gap in their understanding. "It's a matter of motive, Watson," Holmes said, turning to face his friend. Mr. Granger was not merely hiding a project, he was hiding a life that didn't fit the picture he wanted the world to see. Holmes paused, his mind working at full speed. He recalled the faint scent of chemicals in the room where they had found the child's body. The body had not been there for 50 years as they had originally thought. No, it had been placed there much more recently. The question then was why? Why had someone gone to such lengths to conceal this child and its connection to the Granger family? The project, Watson, was not some academic pursuit. It was a cover-up for the child who was never supposed to be born. The family secret Mr. Granger sought to bury was not just a personal scandal, it was a matter of survival. Watson looked at Holmes with confusion. A matter of survival? But what does that mean? Holmes stepped closer, his eyes bright with the clarity of his realization. Mr. Granger, in his desperation, sought a solution to a problem no one could know about. The child, the one hidden away. They were the key. The original owner was afraid, Watson, afraid of what would happen if his dark secret was revealed. He paused, his fingers brushing over the pages of the book. But the project, it wasn't just about hiding the child. It was about control, power. Granger had been involved in something far more sinister, something that tied him to people who would stop at nothing to ensure that the secret was kept hidden. Holmes turned back toward Watson, his gaze unwavering. The child was placed here, hidden away, to keep the Granger name free from disgrace. And someone very close to Granger, didn't want that secret exposed. Not then, and certainly not now. Watson's eyes widened as the pieces began to fall into place. So, you believe the murderer was someone from the family or close to it? Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, the motivation is clear now. The child was a threat to someone's future, and now it appears the house is full of people who have been keeping this secret for far too long. Watson shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. So this was no ordinary murder. It was an execution of a family secret. Precisely, Holmes replied, his tone calm but tinged with the intensity of the moment. The murder was not an accident. It was a calculated act, one that was meant to erase a mistake that someone in this house could never afford to be discovered. Holmes turned toward the fireplace, his face illuminated by the flickering light. But now we must focus, Watson. Who in this house was willing to go to such lengths to protect this secret? Who had the most to lose? Watson leaned forward, his mind racing as Holmes continued. The historian, the caretaker, or someone else entirely? We cannot ignore the fact that everyone we've spoken to has hidden something, but there is one person here who may know more than they've let on. Holmes paused, as if considering his next words carefully. We must return to the caretaker. She has already admitted that she was involved in the cover-up. It's time we press her for the truth. The air in the mansion had grown thick with anticipation, each moment seeming to stretch longer than the last. Holmes's footsteps were firm as he made his way toward the caretaker's quarters, Watson at his side. The faint creak of the floorboards beneath their feet seemed to echo off the walls, underscoring the tension that had been building for days. As they approached the door, Holmes's sharp gaze flickered toward Watson, his expression hard but focused. Remember, Watson, Holmes murmured, his voice low. We are not here to accuse outright, but to expose the truth. The caretaker's involvement goes deeper than she admits, and she is not the only one who has hidden something from us. Watson nodded, though the weight of their discoveries sat heavy in his chest. They had pieced together fragments of the puzzle, but now it was time for the final pieces to fall into place. The secrets of this house were about to be revealed, and there was no turning back. Holmes knocked briskly, his hand steady, and the door creaked open almost immediately. The caretaker stood in the doorway, her tired eyes narrowing slightly as she regarded the two men. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, masking the ever-present mustiness of the mansion, but it did nothing to alleviate the sense of dread that permeated the space. "Mr. Holmes!" "Dr. Watson," she said, her voice calm though there was a tremor beneath the surface. "I was expecting you." Holmes didn't wait for an invitation to enter. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with deliberate focus. The caretaker's quarters were sparse, with little decoration to speak of. A small fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls, and the air felt heavy with the weight of unspoken words. "We've come to speak with you again," Holmes said, his voice measured but sharp, "about the child, about the secret that has been buried in this house for far too long." The caretaker stiffened at the mention of the child, her eyes darting away for just a moment before she looked back at Holmes. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came immediately. She took a hesitant step back, as if weighing her next words. "I've told you all I know," she replied, her voice softer now, tinged with an emotion that Holmes couldn't quite place. "The past is better left behind. It was a mistake that should have never been made." Holmes took a step closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "But the past, Mrs. Temple, never stays buried, and neither do the consequences of our actions. You've kept quiet for too long. Now it's time for you to tell us the full truth." Her lips quivered as she took another step back, but this time she didn't avert her gaze. Instead, she met his stare head-on, as though bracing herself for the storm that was about to break. "You don't understand," she whispered, the weight of her words sinking into the air like a thick fog. "Mr. Granger, he wasn't just protecting his family's reputation. He was protecting something much darker, something that was never meant to be revealed." Watson felt a chill pass over him as he stepped forward. "What are you saying? What was hidden in this house? What was the project really about?" The caretaker closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them again, there was a coldness in them that sent a shiver down Watson's spine. "The project, it was an experiment, a desperate attempt to change the course of nature itself. Mr. Granger was involved with people who promised him power, unimaginable power, but the cost was far greater than he could ever have imagined. The child was the result of that experiment." Holmes' eyes whitened slightly, the truth dawning on him. "A child, born out of an experiment? You mean to say that this child wasn't just the product of a secret affair or a scandal? They were part of something unnatural?" The caretaker nodded, her voice trembling now. "Yes. Granger had made deals with people who were dabbling in dark sciences, alchemy, forbidden practices. He wanted immortality, Watson, and the child was his attempt to create something that could defy death, something that could give him eternal life." Watson took a step back, his mind reeling from the revelation. So the child was part of some kind of scientific ritual, a human experiment? The caretaker nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "Yes, but it didn't go as planned. The child didn't survive as they had hoped, and when the experiment failed, Mr. Granger panicked. He had to hide the truth, so he locked the child away, keeping the secret safe. But it was never truly buried. It lived on in this house, in the hearts of those who knew." Holmes' expression hardened as the weight of the confession settled over him. He understood now. The mystery that had once seemed so distant and elusive was finally coming into focus. The child, the secrets, the conspiracy. It had all been about the pursuit of power, and it had cost someone dearly. "Who else was involved in this, Mrs. Temple?" Holmes asked, his voice now calm but firm. "Who else in this house knew about the project?" The caretaker hesitated, her lips trembling, as if she were on the verge of saying something that would change everything. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Ashford, he's the one who finished it. He's the one who made sure the secret stayed hidden." The cold wind howled through the cracks of the mansion as Holmes and Watson made their way to the study, the air thick with the tension of their final confrontation. Mrs. Temple's confession had shattered the fragile illusion they had held of the mansion as a place of mere forgotten history. It was not a relic of the past they were dealing with. It was a living, breathing secret, one that had festered in the shadows for decades. Now, with the truth in hand, they were ready to face the man who had kept the darkness buried, Mr. Ashford. Holmes walked with purpose, his mind a whirlwind of logic and deductions. The revelation about the child, the project, and Ashford's involvement had only intensified his resolve. This was no longer about uncovering the past. It was about bringing justice to a crime that had never been allowed to see the light of day. The study door creaked open and they stepped inside. Ashford was waiting, his back turned, his fingers drumming nervously against the surface of the desk. The faint smell of tobacco smoke lingered in the air, but it was overpowered by the heavy scent of impending confrontation. The man did not look up as they entered, though the tension in his posture was palpable. He knew what was coming. "You've been waiting for us, Mr. Ashford," Holmes said, his voice steady yet carrying an undercurrent of accusation. Ashford straightened, his hand pausing mid-air as if he had been caught in the act of preparing to flee. When he finally turned to face them, his eyes were bloodshot, his expression a mixture of resignation and defiance. He had known this moment would come, but he had underestimated how relentless Holmes could be. "You're too late," Ashford said, his voice hoarse but still laced with bitterness. "You've uncovered the past, and now there's nothing left for you here. The project is over, and the secret is safe." Holmes studied him, his gaze piercing and unyielding. "Safe, Mr. Ashford? You think the secret is safe?" "No. The truth has already escaped the confines of this house. It will be known." Ashford's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man's face, as if searching for the last traces of guilt that Ashford was trying to hide. "You were involved in the project, weren't you?" Watson interjected, his voice tinged with disgust. "You helped Mr. Granger carry out those experiments, and when the child died, when everything went wrong, you helped bury it all. For what? To protect your own name? To protect the fortune you thought you would inherit?" Ashford clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the dark wood of the desk. "It was never about the money," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "It was about control. The project. It was about power. Granger wanted immortality, and he was willing to sacrifice anything to achieve it. I had to make sure the truth stayed hidden. If it came to light, everything would have been destroyed. The people involved, they wouldn't have allowed it." Watson stepped closer, his voice filled with both revulsion and sympathy. "And what of the child? What of the life you helped erase, just so that your world could stay intact?" Ashford looked away, his gaze drifting to the corner of the room, as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. He swallowed hard, but the silence between them was deafening. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't want it to end like this," he admitted, his shoulders sagging with a mix of guilt and exhaustion. "I never wanted the child to die, but in the end it wasn't about what I wanted, it was about what needed to be done. The experiment had to be covered up, the people who were involved. They would have come for me if I hadn't helped keep the secret, and if I didn't, I wouldn't have survived." Holmes's gaze softened ever so slightly as he regarded the man before him. Ashford was not a monster, not in the way that Holmes had first imagined, but he was a man trapped in his own decisions, a man who had allowed fear to dictate his actions, no matter the cost. "You chose survival over morality," Holmes said quietly, his voice almost gentle, "and now you will face the consequences." The room fell silent once more, but this time it was not the silence of mystery. It was the silence of a conclusion, of a truth that had finally been revealed. The shadow of the child's death still loomed over the mansion, but the weight of the secret had been lifted. Ashford had confessed, and now there was no turning back. Holmes turned toward Watson, the familiar glint of resolve returning to his eyes. "The truth is out, Watson. This house no longer holds its secrets. And now it will be left to the authorities to decide what comes next." Watson nodded, his face grim as he glanced at Ashford one last time. The man had been complicit, but his guilt would be dealt with by others. The wheels of justice were already in motion. As they left the study, the mansion seemed quieter somehow. less oppressive. The mystery had been solved, and yet there was no joy in the resolution. Holmes knew better than to find satisfaction in such a discovery. The consequences were far too great, the cost far too high. And yet, as they stepped out into the crisp air of the night, Holmes could not help but feel a quiet sense of finality. The case was closed. The forgotten killer was no longer forgotten. The truth had come to light, and it had been paid for dearly.